Greetings, everyone. Welcome to UFOs, The Big Picture. I'm Richard Dolan. This is my weekly live stream for the purposes really of just describing some of the big features of the UFO phenomenon for those people who are interested. I try to get down and dirty, get real quick, and get to the fundamentals of a variety of elements of the UFO subject. Today, I want to talk about UFOs and disinformation. And the reason I want to go into this is because there's a lot of topical things happening in our field of study right now. A lot of this is related to the growing, and I have to say very deeply concerning controversy over the attempt in progress right now to trademark the phrase SSP, or Secret Space Program, by Corey Goode. Something that I think is very, very deeply dangerous and disturbing to this field. I'm going to have a lot to say about that in the days and probably weeks to come. For today, I want to back up a little bit and give a little bit of historical perspective on the entire phenomenon of disinformation as it has infected and really damaged in so many ways the UFO phenomenon and subject, not simply in the United States, but really worldwide. But certainly the US has been really the primary area where this has been taking place. Before I get into that, I guess I just will mention I'm going to be doing a live stream on this in great detail during my interview on Monday evening with Jimmy Church. So Jimmy Church will have me on his show, but I'm also live streaming that. There'll be video of me doing that if you care to watch right here on my YouTube channel. And I would encourage you to go check it out. That's Monday, 10 o'clock Eastern time, or I think I go on at 10:30 Eastern time, and we'll go for 2 hours. And this will be one of the key things that I'm going to want to talk about. It'll be interesting because Jimmy's been very closely associated with Corey Goode and with David Wilcock for a pretty long time. And, you know, Jimmy's my friend as well. And I think it'll be just an interesting kind of conversation. We'll see where that goes. I'll also, I have been in touch in some detail nowadays, these last few days, with Joseph Farrell, Catherine Austin Fitz, and most recently, dark journalist Daniel Litz about this matter specifically. In fact, I really enjoyed Daniel's interview yesterday. He did a live stream interview with Walter Bosley. I thought it was excellent. Highly recommend it. And I guess I will just say that there's a number of people in this field who have a stake in doing everything possible to maintain credibility of the UFO subject in the face of claims that are just outlandish and seemingly designed for nothing else than to discredit the field itself. And then also now what appear to be legal struggles or legal efforts to really control the narrative of and what language actually can be used by other people. It's bad enough that we're in a society these days in which language increasingly is being restricted well beyond the field of UFOs, things that people are allowed and not allowed to say, for example. Increasingly, it's becoming very, very onerous. I would say very oppressive. And now we're actually seeing this tendency infect the field of UFOs as well. It's not a good thing. So I would encourage you to keep in mind the live stream I'm going to have with Jimmy Church on Monday. I will nail down a time to do an interview with Joseph Farrell. I'd love to get Catherine. She's out of the country right now and not readily available, but we'll see what we can do. And I'm hoping to talk with Daniel about this as well in the near future. The other thing I just want to mention before I jump in is Tracy and I have created a newsletter. It's Richard Dolan newsletter. I would really encourage you, if you're interested in what I'm doing, you can subscribe. It's totally free. It just gives an update of everything I've done for the week. And you can, probably the simplest place to go is just go to Richard Dolan members, free newsletter, sign up. Don't need to be a member of the site to get that. Go check it out. My Facebook page has a place you can sign up for it as well. By all means, I would encourage you to go to look into that. So let me get into this. First thing I just want to do by way of background in terms of disinformation and UFOs is just talk a little bit in general not about the UFO subject, and not even about disinformation, but about mainstream media. And the reason I want to do this, I love talking about mainstream media, is just to remind all of us that the mainstream media is not your friend. Mainstream media lies, it spins, it censors, it is owned by a very few corporations. It has merged with what we can call a pop culture entertainment industry. That is, I think, a deeply unhealthy uh, connection right there. And, even more significantly, the mainstream media, for the lifetime of every one of us, has cooperated deeply with the intelligence community. And in fact, the mainstream media has been proven to make people sick. And I won't go into all of those details, but it's bad for your health. Um, but relating to UFOs, the mainstream media has engaged in nonstop debunking and ridicule of the UFO subject since 1947, since the Roswell crash. New York Times uh, referring to the whole thing as celestial crockery, and all of this stuff. Ridicule and smear have started with our established media right out of the gate in the modern UFO era. We had the infamous Robertson panel of the early 1950s. This was organized by the CIA as a way to control the narrative of the UFO subject within our wider with our wider society. It's an amazing thing. Back then, the CIA, it was like no big deal for these guys to say, "Oh yeah, we'll get the mainstream media in compliance with our efforts to debunk and ridicule the UFO subject." Walt Disney Corporation, no biggie. Uh, we have a public relations campaign we're going to do. We'll use psychiatrists and astronomers and celebrities. All of this was a given for this CIA panel that was charged with completely keeping the UFO subject out of sight and out of mind, and also in a state of ridicule for the general public. And the other thing that I just want to point out, and this is back in January of 1953, when they made this conclusion, was an intention, a recommendation that the intelligence community should monitor civilian groups studying UFOs because, this is in their words, because of their potentially great influence on mass thinking and the possible use of these groups for subversive purposes. So right out of the gate in the early 1950s, you see the CIA recommending A, debunking and ridiculing of UFOs to the public, and then B, recommending the organizing of infiltration of the UFO community itself. And they have been doing it ever since. And I just want to point out, there's some very good work. This is not proven, but it is very suggestive that many, at least of the so-called contactees of the 1950s, people like George Adamski and George Hunt Williamson and George Van Tassel and a lot of these other folks, Howard Menger, were in fact connected in various ways to the United States intelligence community. My good friend and colleague Nick Redfern did some very good work on this a number of years ago, and just put out these suggestions based on what seemed to be a very reasonably good case, not slam dunk proven, but good enough to show. For example, a Freedom of Information Act document showed that George Van Tassel, who was one of the key contactees of the 50s, had what Nick called quasi-official links to the FBI, helping, in fact, to maintain security at Lockheed against attempted Soviet infiltration back in 1954. Really very interesting. And, keep in mind that the FBI was running the infamous COINTEL program at the exact same time. So here you go. And COINTELPRO was really their program to infiltrate anti-American groups, as they saw it, to derail them. So here they are with a relationship with George Van Tassel, who becomes one of the most famous contactees, getting downloads from extraterrestrials and all of that through the 1950s. Just a thought. George Adamski, the most famous contactee of all, probably of all time, there is reason to wonder if he himself had either CIA or some other kind of intelligence community connections. Again, Nick Redfern cites a 1986 book by an author named George Andrews called Extraterrestrials Among Us. And this author simply just said, look, people who traveled with Adamski noticed that he had been issued a special passport, which was usually reserved for diplomats and high government officials, and just offering the likelihood, or at least the logic, that Adamski could have been a CIA disinformation agent who successfully fulfilled the mission of making UFOs seem so ridiculous, so absurd to the rest of society that independent, in-depth investigation would be made, off limits by the academic community. And I think that's a fair statement to make. We don't have proof that Adamski was a CIA agent, but it has been a longstanding point of suspicion. Nick mentioned the very interesting case back in 1954 as well, a meeting of a number of West Coast contactees, including Truman Bethurem and George Hunt Williamson. They gave a lecture in Cincinnati back in 1954. This was the home of one of the top UFO researchers, Leonard Stringfield. At the time, they couldn't get an endorsement from Stringfield, no surprise there, but they did meet with him in his home. Stringfield wrote later in a book in the 1970s, he said, at one moment I was out of the room, but I was kind of eavesdropping on their conversation, and a number of them were talking about the FBI, and he said he distinctly heard one of them saying, that they believed that FBI had infiltrated their group. And as soon as Stringfield entered the living room, all talk about the FBI just stopped. But it did make him very deeply suspicious. And then finally, Nick, in this particular article, just talked about Howard Menger and pointed out that Menger as well, back in the 50s, in one of his books, did state that the Pentagon had asked him to participate in an experiment to test the public's reaction to extraterrestrial contact. So all of these things make you wonder. I mean, it's suspicion, but well-grounded, that the intelligence community has been engaged in the whole contactee element of the UFO subject back as far back as the 1950s. Has it ever stopped? Well, I don't think it stopped. I think the reason, by the way, that they've done this is because UFOs matter. UFOs matter. UFOs are important to national security. They involve a radical, I would say, revolutionary presence of something that is not from this society, from this civilization, that is well beyond what we are supposed to have in our world, and it's disruptive. And so it has to be disabled at all costs. I believe that. Now, we've been in the age of the internet for a little while now, and what I would suggest to you is that what we call mainstream media, the corporate media, the establishment dinosaur media, has continued by and large. It's been a little different in the last year with some of the announcements with the TTSA connection and all of that. But let me come back to that in another live stream with you. But I would still maintain that the mainstream media has continued to ridicule UFOs at every step of the way, at every opportunity to ignore, ridicule. They're on the fast track to calling the whole UFO subject fake news, in my opinion. Meanwhile, making their own portrayal of news crazier, more confusing, more distracted than ever. But UFOs are constantly ridiculed. And I just want to point out a very insightful statement by a lady named Cheryl Atkinson. She was formerly with CBS News. She's done a TED Talk, I think maybe a couple of TED Talks, and she's got some very good books out there where she really talks very, very insightfully about corporate media propaganda in today's world. And she talks about astroturfing. And if you don't know what astroturfing is, you can look that up. It's essentially attempts by corporate and government bodies to basically spin their corporate public image for the rest of the world. But one thing she points out is how a lot of these government and corporate propagandists will use inflammatory language to discredit their opponents. Words like crank, quack, nutty, lies, paranoid, pseudo, conspiracy. Sound familiar? Yes. So the efforts are still out there to delegitimize the UFO subject. And again, I would say really look for the theme of fake news to continue to spread. And it will be the latest and greatest way that establishment um, power structure will use to control the cultural narrative, to disable legitimate inquiries into subjects like UFOs and other off the limit subjects as well, to kind of, steer them off to the fringe. Now, I want to talk about the current bit of disinformation that is going on relating to a secret space program. There's been quite a lot of it over the last decade or more. The first thing I want to say, because I've written and talked a great deal in my own career on what I believe is a genuine secret space program. And there's a lot of reasons to believe that there is one. Right off the bat, the United States government has an absolute unqualified need to dominate space. That need will never go away. It's always there. It's omnipresent. And if you want to, dominate the world, you've got to dominate space. If you want all of your smart bombs to land on all of their smart targets and destroy the smart targets that you want to get rid of, you've got to dominate space. You cannot allow that. And that means massive spy satellites, massive covert weaponry, and all the rest. The question is, how far does that go? That's a good question. I'll come back to that one. But that's the first reason to believe that there is a secret space program. That's could be purely conventional technology, for all we know, in that relationship. But then there's other things. There's a whole list of moon oddities and atmospheric oddities. There's a whole list of leaks from astronauts, from NASA, from other legitimate sources. All right. Recently, Carl Wolf died just a week ago. Carl Wolf, unfortunately, passed away. And I consider him a very important, legitimate leaker of what we can call evidence for a secret space program. There's Donna Hare, another one, and Donna's still around, and she also worked at NASA in the early 1970s and spoke at length and explicitly about how UFO photographs were airbrushed out by NASA, and how UFOs accompanied all the NASA missions out into space and so forth. There's Ken Johnson, who has now become a friend of mine. Ken was a former manager of data and photo control at NASA for many years, and has spoken, explicitly about how during the Apollo missions on the moon, that there were definite UFOs monitoring activity there as well. There's a number of confirmed events of objects coming in from deep space being monitored by NORAD and by our own satellites. Again, I've talked about these before, and I don't want to go into all the details here. But these are all very good reasons for assuming that there's a secret space program, not even to mention the testimony and evidence of UFO crash retrievals, reverse engineering out of Groom Lake, including black triangles and more. All of that, yes. So now we come to the last 10, 15 years, and we hear about things like Mars jump rooms. We hear about Corey Goode's 20 and back programs. We hear about other people talking about fighting battles on Mars and the like. So there's a few things that we can say about all of these. There's a definite logical failure of most of these claims. When I say logical failure, let's talk about the 20 and back program. All right. So you're 17 years old and you go to Mars for 20 years. So that means you're 37 years old when you're done. That means you've grown up, you've matured, you've had a life, you've presumably had relationships. Do you have a family? Do you have a sexual relationship? Do you have, really think long and hard about this. What kind of life do you have when you're there for 20 years? And then you become 37 years old and suddenly, boom, you're back in your, living room, so that mom never even knows you left the house. I would just say, if you had a next door neighbor who said these types of stories to you, really seriously, who'd said, oh, yes, I went to Mars for 20 years. And you'd be like, oh, really? Did you? Yes, I was there for 20 years. And then you would say, that seems a little odd. But you might, to humor them, say, well, okay, good. You have any documentation on this? Do you have any? Oh, no, I have no documentation. You'd say, oh, well, did people miss you while you were gone? And your neighbor would say, no, as a matter of fact, I was brought back to my body, back in time and back to my body 20 years earlier, so no one knew I was gone. And if you had a neighbor who would say this to you, you would, I don't think you'd have any problem thinking my neighbor's a little bit crazy. Like you would think that. But there's a very odd effect that happens when you get these very same people and you put them on a stage and there's 500 or 1,000 people watching them in hushed tones, practically reverentially. And somehow these stories take on a power. Back in the 1930s, Joseph Goebbels talked about the big lie. And he said, small lies, they're easy to dismiss and people won't believe it, little lie. But a big lie can be believed by lots of people because it's so outrageous, it's so brazen. People think, oh my God, it's got to be true. And that principle has never gone away. We are looking at a proliferation of big lies that have infiltrated, infected, littered the world of genuine, serious UFO research. So not only are there logical failures of really nearly all of these claims, but there are, of course, failures of evidence in all of them. None of the so-called Mars whistleblowers or any of these other kinds of contemporary whistleblowers, first of all, they're not even whistleblowers. All right. They not only do they provide no evidence of their claims, but they don't even prove their own identity. They don't even prove their own career. And of course, there are many people who are willing to say, I knew so-and-so back in the day, and they were absolutely, they did drugs, and they did this, and they did that. Like, these would not be candidates for a military 20 and back program, clearly, and so on. On top of that, you've got the fact that these claims are, all of them, sensationalist in nature. They really remind one more of a Hollywood script than reality, where they are heroes, essentially, where they are ambassadors for Earth, vis-a-vis the other races or whatever it is. It's always this battle of, pure good versus pure evil, again and again and again. It makes for a great movie script. Reality, I seriously doubt, goes like that. And then fundamentally, there's an inability, an impossibility, really, to prove or disprove these claims. It's called falsifiability. If something isn't falsifiable, that doesn't make it false. It just makes it like you have no ability to prove it or disprove it. And that's a problem from the point of view of science. It's a problem from the point of view of any kind of rational philosophy. Anyone can make a claim, but if you don't have the ability even to test their claim, what are you supposed to think about that? And this type of way of thinking has permeated this section of the field of UFO research to such an extent that it's hard to ignore it anymore. I tried ignoring it for years. I thought, well, this is going to go away. And it doesn't go away. I mean, if something's not falsifiable, that doesn't automatically mean it can't be true. I suppose in theory, anything can be true. But the reality is we have to deal with the practical nature of how do we treat information? What standards do we have when information comes our way? And this is what we need to do. One of the, just as a quick aside, I think one of the damaging effects of a kind of postmodernism in our society is it has affected the UFO field. In other words, by postmodernism, I'm simply meaning when someone makes a statement, you often will find people focusing on what's their motivation, who are they working for, rather than what they're actually saying. And yes, it is important. It's always important to know what are the motivations or the possible motivations of someone else. But the fact is that you and I can't always know what those motivations are. Motivations of people are often very difficult to know. Everyone's got ulterior motives, of course. That's the way the world is. That's the way human beings are. There is a danger that has been happening in this field and in our society in general of looking at motivations even at the exclusion of actual statements of what people are actually saying. And I just think that that's something that we want to keep in mind, and I'll probably bring this up in the future. So bottom line, and I'm going to wrap this up in a couple of minutes here. There's overwhelming evidence that there is a secret space program. There's very strong likelihood that it involves radical technology and what I have often called a breakaway civilization. That it very possibly can involve contact with other beings. And I don't say that I know this for a fact because I don't know it for a fact, but I think it's a possibility and maybe even a likelihood. And I would certainly say that a secret space program is a significant part of the UFO cover-up and the general disclosure scenario. So the bottom line on disinformation, well, actually, let me mention a little bit more of this before I wrap up, because there's one other element of this, which is that the UFO field has had disinformation through confirmable disinformation from the intelligence community, not simply through the contactees, excuse me, but through infiltration of UFO organizations. So the group, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, they've been defunct for years, but they were a major group in the southwest of the US for decades, run by Coral and James Lorenzen. They spoke explicitly about how they knew that they were infiltrated by Air Force intelligence and potentially CIA. The organization NICAP, run by the Marine Corps Major Donald E. Kehoe, was absolutely penetrated from the beginning by CIA operatives. In fact, they threw Kehoe out of leadership around 1969, 1970, and then ran NICAP into the ground over the next decade and just destroyed the organization. MUFON, talked about this many times. MUFON has had its own very, very unsettling connections to the United States intelligence community. This was very notable in prior years, and I'm not saying it's absolutely the case now. I don't know what's the case with MUFON today, but it certainly was the case for the longest time. In fact, that was partly the reason I talked about this at a MUFON symposium in 2011, and I think it was the reason why I was unofficially banned from MUFON symposium for the next 6 years after that. That was interesting. So the point is, and then of course you've got the famous case of Air Force officer of Air Force Office of Special Investigations, Richard Dolan, back in 1980 or so, feeding disinformation to people like Paul Benowitz. Well-known case where Benowitz was given falsified information with the help of UFO researcher William Moore. And this has all been well documented. We know all about this. We know a lot about it. Point is that the UFO field has been subject, confirmably, to disinformation by the intelligence community for a reason. Because we are the people who are putting out the energy and doing the serious research to expose this hidden reality that we consider to be important, right? Whether it's a UFO subject or a secret space program, these matter. And those organizations that are charged with maintaining their security and their secrecy, well, does it strike you as convenient? Like if you were managing a genuine clandestine space program that had some interest in monitoring, let us say, space-based UFOs or monitoring clandestine activity beyond Earth orbit, you wouldn't want the rest of the public looking into it, would you? You wouldn't want researchers investigating it, would you? No. So it would be very convenient indeed to have a variety of people telling stories, campfire stories, essentially, in which they so ridiculously aggrandize themselves and make themselves seem like heroes and tell stories that are so incredibly unbelievable, lacking in any kind of even remote believability to the general public, that it would so discredit any thought of a secret space program. And so there you go. That would keep your program secret for a little bit longer, wouldn't it? Which is what it's all about. I mean, who are these people today? I mean, I don't know any of them on a deeply personal level. I don't know Corey Good on a personal level or any of the others. I mean, I've interacted with them from time to time. Are these people explicitly all doing disinformation? I couldn't say that. I have no idea. Are they simply out to make money from a gullible public? Well, I'm sure some of them are doing that. Are they just useful idiots? Are they doing the work to make the field look ridiculous for another organization and they don't even know that they're doing it? It's totally possible. All right. But I would say with, most of these claims have a major whiff of self-aggrandizement and a cult-like quality to many of them that any real SSP, and I'm using that phrase, any real secret space program will find these so-called whistleblowers a godsend, all right, to keep the program, the real program, secret and safe just for a little longer, and that's all it's about. So I'm going to come back to this theme, and as I said at the beginning of this talk, I'm going to have I'll be doing a program with Jimmy Church on Monday, and you can check that on his channel, or you can check it on mine. My YouTube channel will have it live streamed. That's 10, I believe I'm going on at 10:30 Eastern time. Look for an interview that I'll be doing. I'm trying to set this up with Dr. Joseph Farrell. We have been talking about this, and I'd like to maybe have a chat with dark journalist Daniel Litz about this as well, and look for me to hopefully bring Catherine Austin Fitz into the mix on this when she's available. I mentioned my newsletter. By all means, go to my website, Richard Dolan Members. You can subscribe to my newsletter. It'll give you free updates on everything that I'm doing. And with that, I want to thank you very much for your time. And let's keep in mind, every field and every era of human history has always had its challenges. This is ours. We have lots of different challenges, and they're not necessarily more difficult than what other people have dealt with in the past. Our job is to keep our heads, stay clear, stay focused. Don't turn our opponents into enemies. I don't believe in that. I don't believe in that. I don't like to demonize people that I disagree with. But I would say we need to defend this field of ours, for those of us who care, from those who would bring disrepute to it and discredit to it as well. So with that, I'm going to leave you, and I'll join you next week. Thanks for everyone who supports my work. Always appreciate that. I'm only now seeing you guys in the chat. Well done, and have a good one. Catch you later.